What are the best paid for tax resources that you can use to find the answer to any tax question and research a technical point? This is what you'll find out from this episode. You're listening to episode 89 of the Tax Professionals podcast, helping tax professionals to improve their careers, develop and progress.
Welcome to the Tax Professionals podcast, the podcast dedicated to helping you improve your tax career. Here's your host, Jack Bonehill.
Hi everyone and welcome to this episode. This episode is actually a follow-on episode to episode 80, which is all about the best free tax resources to use to answer any tax question and research technical points. As you can hear from that episode, there are plenty of great free resources that you can use, but in order to have the tools to always do tax research efficiently and effectively, you need to supplement the free resources with paid for resources. Having the most appropriate resource for the research you're doing at that time can save you so much time, effort, and decrease the chances of you missing something or get wrong. It can also give you some perspective or guidance that you hadn't previously appreciated but can use to your advantage. You don't need every paid for resource, and you probably won't have access to all of them anyway, whether you run your own business or employ, because it would just cost a fortune for that business. But you'll probably have access to at least some of the paid for resources, or realise that you could do with getting some of the paid for resources. I actually put a business case together in the past for my employer to get what I think is the best case or resource out there called Westlaw, which you'll hear about a bit more later in the episode. Even if you do have access to paid for resources, you may not have the best ones for the type of tax that you deal with. So in this episode, I'm sharing with you what I believe are the best tax resources based on my experiences. And as you'll hear, this is basically a combination of online digital resources, books in paper copy and books in digital copy. If you really want to master tax research, then take a look at my Tax Research Masterclass. I've created this to teach you how to do quality tax research and find the answer to any tax question. The next one is in February 2024. And if you head on over to the taxprofessionalspodcast.com/masterclasses, you get more details, including details on how to enroll. There are some of the podcast episodes too relating to tax research, so I've put a link to each of those in the show notes for this episode. Rough timings for each section of this episode, along with the links mentioned throughout this episode, can be found in the show notes for this episode at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP89. I just realised that's an awful lot of episodes within a single sentence, but yes, the show notes for this episode can be found at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP89. And the link to the show notes is the only link you need to remember, because all the links mentioned throughout this episode can be found in the show notes. Without further ado, let's get to the episode. The first paid for resource that I'm going to talk to you about is Croner-I Navigate product. So this product is completely digital, completely online, and is the one that I probably use the most personally when doing tax research. In fact, it's not even probably the one that I use the most. It definitely is the one that I use the most, because I actually use Croner-I Navigate as the starting point for pretty much all the research that I do, because that's where I access tax legislation. It's where I'm looking to find relevant HMRC guidance pages in pretty much all circumstances, and it's also where I start when I want to find some good guidance that isn't HMRC's and which isn't legislation, because Croner-I have some really good guidance resources as well. And it's definitely overall my favourite resource. I just find it easy to use, and that the content within it is good. So the main guidance that I use in Croner-I is what's called Tax In-Depth, and it's pretty much exactly what it says on the tin. It's super comprehensive, in-depth guidance that pretty much talks you through everything that you need to know in relation to a particular tax rule or area of tax. Obviously, there's always exceptions, and sometimes it might not cover absolutely everything that I would like it to, because sometimes it pretty much does, I suppose, tell you what the legislation is without an awful lot of extra commentary around it. But that's usually because there's not really any good HMRC guidance around it, or any other commentary out there around it, or even any case law that helps to interpret a certain rule or certain tax law. But what's really good about Croner-I for me is how it always links through to other relevant, how it links through to relevant legislation, case law, other Croner guidance, because they have lots of different kind of types of guidance, which I'll talk you through in a minute. also links you to HMRC guidance. And so you kind of get the picture. It links you through to a bunch of different resources, which you can carry on reading to get further information, or another resource that might really help you with a particular aspect or a particular issue that you're looking at. So other aspects of Croner-I's Navigate platform is something called Navigate Tax. They have something called Tax Quick Overview, which essentially is clear and concise explanations. But these explanations, because it is a quick overview, are very high level, so they don't give you the detail to deal with any complicated scenarios. But for straightforward, obvious, common scenarios, quick overview is good. Croner also has tax practical guidance, which again is pretty much exactly what it says in the tin. Croner's pretty good at creating these products that are pretty self-explanatory based on the title, but the practical guidance helps you to get the job done quickly on common and important areas by giving the straightforward, to the point guidance. It doesn't always cover complex topics, and usually where research is needed, for me personally, is on those more difficult, complicated scenarios, which is why I do use Tax in Depth pretty much all the time. They also have what's called tax specialist titles, and so this is where they have books or commentaries from leading experts, as they like to describe it, and it's on like particular topics. So they've got a lot of Claritax books on under this kind of section of guidance, and the only one that I've personally used is actually what's called Gordon on Schedule 36 notices, and this was when I was dealing with some difficult HMRC inquiries where Schedule 36 notices were potentially going to be involved, and I wanted to discourage HMRC officers from issuing the notices because I just thought it was going to be pointless for them because we're just going to appeal it and they weren't going to be entitled to the information that they were asking for. And I found that particular, it's a book. It is a book, but these books are online and categorized just like other online resources. So whilst it is in book form and you can buy it in book form, Croner-I does have them in kind of their normal guidance format, their online digital format. But this book by Gordon, so the Keith Gordon that is, on Schedule 36 notices, for me was just the absolute resource I needed on Schedule 36 notice at the time, because the legislation itself is ambiguous down to interpretation. And so in that circumstance, you can go look at lots of case law, because case law will give you interpretation assistance, I suppose, on the provisions that were relevant in that case. But because the client I was doing work for when I ended up using that was a fairly small client that didn't have deep pockets, and so they couldn't afford to have like a really in-depth, time-consuming exercise undertaken by us, because it would have cost them a lot of money that they didn't have. And Gordon on Schedule 36 notices just got completely straight to the point, quick and easy to use. It pointed me in the direction of some cases that I knew were going to be relevant after reading that book, and it just made, I suppose, the whole process for that client in particular easy. They have Croner-I has all tax legislation and treaties online as well, and you can search them through various functions. So you can even get linked through to them through some of the other guidance that you've looked at, or you can actually use what's called the statute finder, which is if you know exactly what act or regulations or whatever it is that you need to look into, and you know the section number or the paragraph, then you can literally just type it in and it'll take you straight to that, which, because I've now been working in tax and employment taxes for so long, I know way too many section numbers that I care to admit off by heart. You can also access HMRC manuals through Croner-I, and they have a good search facility on there as well. I find it better than HMRC's search function. But if you go and listen to the other episode where I talked about the best free tax resources, you'll hear me talk a little bit about Google Operators, which, to be honest, is still the best search function in my opinion for accessing HMRC manuals. And then I suppose finally but not least, Croner-I does have tax cases on there, and it's not the best case law resource that I've ever used, but it is definitely now a close second, because they have some really good summaries of cases on there. So you can pretty much find any case. I'm not sure how far it goes back, but at least for cases from, I'm going to say, about 2010, they've got summaries on there as well as the cases. And the summaries I find really useful because they really do take the weight out of needing to look at the case in a lot of cases, reading the full case transcripts. And even where you do have to go look at the full case, when you come back to the summary afterwards, it makes a lot of sense. So you don't need to worry about like summarizing things and breaking things down so much, because the case summaries do that for you. So if you do want to go have a look at Croner-I's Navigate without actually paying for it, then you can actually just go to their website, which is library.croner-I, all one word, no hyphens, no space or anything, .co.uk. There's a link to this in the show notes. And whilst the content is actually behind a paywall, you can actually search through Croner without having access to it, so you can see what it looks like, see what it would look like to search and stuff, which I think will be quite helpful. But anyway, on top of that, Croner have actually agreed with me that all listeners of the podcast, so that's any of you listening to this episode, you can actually get a 3 weeks trial just to try it out and see what you think of it, because, well, I thought that'd be really useful to get. So I asked them if they would let me offer that to you all, and they agreed. I think you guys will, if you don't use it already, you'll see what I mean about how it's such a useful resource. So ways that you can search for material anyway in Croner-I is it's pretty much like every other online resource, I'm going to say. So you have like a search bar, which is the equivalent of Google, I suppose. You can just search through that. You can go into like each piece of guidance itself. So if you wanted to go into Navigate Tax, you could, Tax in Depth, you could go into that piece of guidance, and then you could kind of go through it like a book, I suppose, by going to the content page, going, I want to go to that bit, and then going into the certain subsection within that section and so on. So you can do that way too. But for me, I pretty much always use the search bar and the statute finder, the manual finder, and the case law finder. So those are the ways that I tend to find things. That's where you actually know what the case is or know what the manual or legislation is, and you go straight to it through the finder. So it's not just the 1 week free trial that you guys can get access to. And if you do want this, by the way, you can just message me and I'll pass your details over to the relevant person at Croner-I. But you can send me a message on LinkedIn, so there'll be a link in the show notes to my LinkedIn profile if you don't already have me added. Or you can send me an email, so there will also be my email address in the show notes of this episode. My email is jack@thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com. So jack@thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com. And if you can find any other way to contact me too, it doesn't really matter. Just get in contact with me if you do want a 3 weeks trial to see what it's like to use Croner. If I were you though, what I would do is wait until you've got kind of a meaty, complex piece of research to do. Get your free trial at that point, so you can make sure you get good use out of that free trial and really get to understand and get a feel for what it's like. So if you've been around listening to the podcast for some time, you'll also know that Croner-I allow all listeners of the podcast to get access to their news service. So you can get access to what's called Croner Navigate Lite completely for free. There'll be a link to how you can subscribe to that in the show notes too, if you're interested. The next resource I'm going to mention is Tolley Library and Guidance. I'm not exactly clear on what the title is for Tolley's online resource, but this is what I'm talking about here. So their online digital resource, which is the equivalent of Croner-I's Navigate. And overall, it is very similar to Croner-I's Navigate product. They are competitors, I think it's fair to say. So Croner have the in-depth commentary on different tax points, and Tolley's have Simon's Taxes as the equivalent. So they have a complete, I suppose, comparable there. Just like Croner, all the Tolley's resources do cross-reference. So like if you're looking at a piece of legislation and under the Tolley's digital resource, then it will reference you to Simon's Taxes and HMRC guidance, etc. So, in that regard, they are very similar in terms of resources. Tolley's have their, I suppose, equivalent of the specialist titles that Croner-I have. So they have the Tolley's guidance books, which are written by experts, so actual tax specialists. And these books are like specialist titles. And so there might be ones that are, I suppose, relevant for the area of tax that you work in that could do really good for you. So, just like I always suggest anyway with tax research and stuff, is get to know your resources, get to know what's out there, because you're going to end up having a piece of research that you do where the stuff that you usually use isn't going to work well. And I had that exact scenario when it came to doing some expatriate research earlier on in my career. And this was before I finished my CTA exams, where I learned a lot about the overseas side of being an employment tax expert. But at that time, I really didn't know much at all. And the resources that I had access to at the time, which included all the free resources like HMRC guidance and just general Google searches and legislation, just weren't cutting it for me at all. I was really struggling to find the answers to the questions and the tax implications of the scenarios that I had at the time. But we did have in a little paper library at work, which we did actually have like shelves or even a full cupboard full of different tax books back then. This was probably 2018, 19 maybe. And I knew we had that library. And so because I was struggling so much when doing this one piece of research, I went over to that library, looked at what books we had, picked out the expatriate tax planning book, and I used that. And that is still the go-to resource that I have personally whenever I'm doing expatriate tax research where I don't already know the answer and I don't know where the legislation is or the good HMRC guidance, etc. I start with the expatriate tax planning book. I think I probably always will now because to me that is the go-to resource for that type of research. So I suppose some of the downsides of Tolley's for me are that they don't seem to have the equivalent of these almost the simpler guidance resources like what Croner have. So Croner have the overview product, they have the practical product, and Tolley's don't seem to have the equivalent of that. So you've either got in-depth complicated guidance, which is Simon's Taxes, or nothing else. And Simon's Taxes, because it's so detailed, it is not quick to use. So if you want a quick answer to something, Simon's Taxes is not the place to go. But they don't seem to have any other, I suppose, apart from the guidance books, they don't have many other places to go. And for me, it was always kind of slow and clunky when I was trying to, I suppose, try and get to the answer quickly on something that wasn't particularly complicated. And the ways that you can search for material on Tolley's are very similar to Croner. So you have a search bar and you can go to the content itself, and they might even have an equivalent to the statute finder and so on. But I actually don't have access to Tolley's anymore. I haven't for probably about 12 months now. I had access to it when I started working at my current employer, Danes. I had access to it then. About probably 12 months after I started at Danes, we had Croner. About 24 months ago, we had access to both Croner and Tolley's. So I again went back to Tolley's just to see if I thought it would be better in some kind of research scenarios. But for me, I just found Croner so much more easy to use. And I don't even think that's because I've been using it for so long. I just find that it's more modern in its approach, easier to find materials, more variety of content. And so I ended up still using Croner all the time instead of Tolley's. But as I say, for me, I've got the expatriate tax planning book, which Tolley's do, and that's still my go-to resource. So it's not that I don't think Tolley's is useful, full stop. Well, it is very useful. I just find Croner better in pretty much all cases. But I know plenty of people, to be fair, who prefer Tolley's. It's just that I don't. Unfortunately, I don't have any free trials or anything for listeners at this point. So Tolley, if any of you are listening to this episode and you want to offer this to any listeners of the podcast, then please do get in touch. This next resource is one that I mentioned right at the start of this episode, and that is Westlaw. And I think it's wider than just case law, but when I'm talking about Westlaw here, I'm talking about the case law resource that they have. Back in my first tax job, probably about, I'm going to say 9 months in, I was doing some case law research for the partner in the firm that I was working for. And I didn't really know an awful lot about what case law was at that point, or really much about what it meant. But I spent hours looking for some relevant cases to the scenario that the partner had asked me to look at, and it was super slow. I was like looking on Google for ages, wasn't really getting much luck, and wasn't making any progress with any kind of speed anyway. And I came across Westlaw a few times, and every single time I was like, it looks like they've got good cases, but I can't access them because it's behind a paywall. But I saw that there was a free trial, and so in the end, after I was, I suppose, struggling so hard to get access to good relevant cases quickly, I signed up to the free trial. And I found out that you can search for cases that are relevant to a particular bit of legislation. And so because the scenario that I was dealing with, I knew the legislation that was relevant, I went into case law. I told it I wanted all cases that were relevant to that bit of legislation, which was to do with Schedule 36 notices at the time, which is under Finance Act 2008, I believe, if I'm not wrong there. And it listed all those cases, and then straight away I had a list of all potentially relevant cases. I didn't have to filter through information as much. And then what I did is I just went through one by one, looked at the cases, looked at the summaries, and then I could quickly decide whether or not that case might be relevant or whether it definitely wasn't relevant, and I could put it in the disregard pile. And so I got to the cases super quick. I found out ones that were relevant quickly. I could then read them because I had them there, and I was able to summarize them and give some useful information to the partner at the firm I was working at the time. And in the inquiry against HMRC that we were dealing with, we got HMRC to back down, so it was a massive result. And doing that same piece of research, it would have either taken me days more to do it if I didn't have Westlaw. And potentially, even if it did take me days more, I don't think I would have been able to come across all the cases as well as I did using Westlaw. So for me, it was a blessing, a complete blessing for that piece of work. And so then when I got asked to do some future case law research when the 3-week trial ran out, I ended up putting a business case together because I just knew how much time it was going to save me that I could spend doing other things which I thought would be valuable to my employer. So I put the business case forward, and they ended up subscribing to it for me, which was a massive win for me because I used it quite a few times, and every single time I thought it was absolutely excellent. Still the best case or resource that I've used to date. There's probably other ways too that you can research relevant case law. But for me, that legislation source of saying what's all the cases that deal with this piece of legislation or that are on this piece of legislation or quote it, etc., that for me was just an absolute game changer. So just on that alone, I would recommend for people who need to do any form of case law research at work. If you really want to ace using the resources mentioned throughout this episode and just ace research, doing tax research more generally, then go take a look at the tax research masterclass that I've created. And I've created this to teach you how to do quality tax research and find the answer to any tax question. The next one is in February 2024. So head on over to thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/masterclasses to get the full details on the masterclass, including all modules and just, I suppose, further details generally on the masterclass. You can also find details on how to enroll in that page too. The next resource that I'm going to mention is Tolley's tax books, and I've touched upon this real briefly now because you can access pretty much all these books, I believe, through the online resources that Tolley's offer. But I want to have a separate segment for just talking about the Tolley's tax books because they do have loads of comprehensive books, pretty much covering, as far as I can tell, every tax area. So whether you're in employment taxes or corporation tax or OMB or international tax, they've probably got a book on that topic somewhere. And as I say, kind of with me, I've got the expatriate tax planning book from Tolley's, which has been an absolute game changer for me in that regard and still my go-to resource. And so there's probably got to be at least one Tolley's tax book that you think is the go-to resource for you when you're doing a particular piece of tax work. And I'm pretty sure that you should be able to add all of the Tolley's tax books to the digital resource if you got it. And even if you don't have it, surely now I'll be really surprised if you couldn't get it digitally rather than just getting paper copies, which you can still get. And we do have paper copies for the expatriate tax planning book in the office. And because I work at home a lot, if I did ever want to use that book for a reason, I would have to specifically go into the office to use it because we don't have access to it online anymore, as far as I'm aware anyway. Obviously, you've got legislation too. So you've got your orange and your yellow legislation books, which I'm sure pretty much everyone will know of already, but they still exist. And if I was using a legislation book, that is the legislation book that I would use. But I do use online resources now just because I don't have the books at home, and obviously the digital resource will just come around me wherever my laptop is. But I still do like using the Tolley's legislation books when I've got them available to me, I suppose. So with the guidance books, it really is about finding ones that are right for the area of work that you work in and for, I suppose, a really particular topic. And if you can find one that's right for the query or the scenario that you're dealing with, it can make your life really easy by just having the right resource there. So I can definitely recommend that everyone takes a look at the Tolley's tax books. Maybe find out if your employer's got any of them available to you. And if they don't, and you think there's one's going to be really useful for a particular thing, then you can ask them potentially to get a copy of it, put a business case forward like I did for Westlaw. Claritax books is the next resource that I'm going to mention. And this is just, I suppose, another equivalent to Tolley's tax books. But Claritax, what I like about the Claritax books is that they're really specific, targeted, and niche to kind of a really particular tax area. And so it is really good when you need guidance on a particular topic because it covers it with a lot of depth. And it's very relevant with some, at least with the one that I've used, which is Schedule 36 Notices by Keith Gordon. It has good examples, good sources, good reference to cases, and it was just an excellent source for me. And I have no doubt that the other Claritax books are exactly the same as that. So what I think I'm going to suggest is, just like with the Tolley's books, is to take a look and just see what's available and see whether you have access to them at work already. And then even if you don't, then if you're doing a complicated piece of research where you're just having, a hard time getting to the answer, then you can always put a case together to potentially get one of these books and get the answer more quickly. And that's the thing, by the way, I'm just going to touch upon a little bit more is you'll probably be able to find the answer anyway to a lot of things. But if you have a good resource, you'll be able to get to the answer much more quickly. And in our world, I always think time is so precious. If you can save yourself any time at all, it's usually worth it. And then in very rare cases, you will really struggle to find the answer without the right resource. And Claritax tax books is another one of those where it can really help you get to the bottom of those tricky situations. The last resource that I'm going to mention in this episode is Bloomsbury books. And so you're probably thinking, flipping out, this is the third resource, which is a book or books that you're referencing in this episode. And that's for good reason, because as you've probably heard me say numerous times now, and you're sick of me saying, like, if you find a good resource, which tends to happen a lot in terms of the specialist books that people do, is you're going to save yourself so much time and effort and get to the answer much more quickly and have a better insight than what you would without them. And so Bloomsbury is another example of extra resources that are out there that could really help you in certain situations. And so when I actually incorporated my business from sole trader to a limited company, I used a few of the Bloomsbury books. I actually used two of them in particular. I found out that they had a book called Incorporating and Disincorporating, and that was just a game changer for me in this case, because it really did tell me about every single point, every single thing that I needed to consider when I was incorporating my company. And I also used Rainey's tax planning book as well, Peter Rainey's tax planning. So I actually started with the Rainey's tax planning book because I suppose the reason I was incorporating was because I was tax planning. I knew, or at least I thought before I did the calculations, which turned out to be true, I thought that incorporating was going to be more tax efficient for me overall. And so I wanted to do it. And so I started with Rainey's tax planning book. There wasn't enough depth in there for the situation I had personally. And so I needed something with a bit more depth. And I came across the Incorporating and Disincorporating book. So I spent hours, really a long time, going through both of those books to get the information I needed. It didn't give me everything I needed, and so I had to do a bit of additional research outside of that, but it gave me such a solid starting point, and there really wasn't much else for me to do after going through those books. So again, like with Tolley's, like with Claritax, I can suggest that you just have a look at the Bloomsbury books that are available, because you might have some masterpieces in there that are going to help you with a piece of research, like these Bloomsbury books did for me when I incorporated my business. So I'm pretty sure they have digital and paper, like Tolley's, like Claritax. If they don't have digital and paper anymore, they're missing a trick. But I'm going to say in terms of searching in books, so I could have put this under any section, really. I could have put it under Tolley's or the Claritax section. But in terms of searching in books, the way that I would, the way that I do this anyway, is I usually use the contents pages and like the detailed contents pages, if they have it, to just kind of flick through quickly to get an idea of what's in the book. And if I'm looking for something in particular, whether I think it's going to cover it or not, and I kind of note down all the relevant chapters, or at least the chapters that might be relevant, and then I list down within that chapter what parts of that chapter I think are going to be relevant, and then I go check them all. But you can also use indexes in books as well. I just find that indexes make you jump around too much in the books, and so I prefer to go through a bit more methodically, I suppose, through using the contents pages and come up with useful resources from there. In summary then for this episode, I suppose resources are broken down into almost two categories in my mind, at least anyway. You have the online digital resources like Croner-I Navigate and the Tolley Library, and you also have the, I suppose, books, which nowadays are either in paper or digital form. The good thing about the online digital resources is that there's just vast amounts of information over them. So there's information there pretty much covering every situation that you could think of. And as I say, I start pretty much all my research personally in Croner. And if you want a free week's trial for using Croner and getting a feel for that, then just drop me a message either on LinkedIn, email, or any other way that you can get in contact with me. For case law, the best resource that I've ever found personally is Westlaw, and I would always use that if I had access to it. Unfortunately, I don't anymore. But yeah, if you're doing lots of case law research, or you've got a particularly big project on it, then you might save yourself enough time just from one project by using Westlaw rather than not using Westlaw. And finally, there's loads of the specialist books out there that can be used in specific circumstances, and that's the way that I use them personally anyway. And so they are usually in both paper and digital form. All links mentioned throughout this episode are in the show notes for this episode at thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/TTPP89. This includes links to my tax research masterclass, which I can suggest you have a look at if you want to really get good at doing tax research and just getting to the answer of any tax question. It also includes links to sign up for Croner-I's Navigate Lite product for free. You can get my email address and how to contact me if you want to get access to that full Navigate product for a week. And there's just links to all the resources mentioned throughout this episode too. In particular, there's links to the other podcast episodes that I've done that are on doing tax research, and also the best ones and also the episode I mentioned that is on the best free resources for doing tax research. My next 2 masterclasses are in February 2024. So that's the tax research masterclass plus the tax advice masterclass. So why not head on over and take a look at the details and those masterclasses in full, and send me any questions that you have. But if you do one thing after listening to this episode, go and take a look at the show notes, because you'll be able to see all the stuff that we've mentioned throughout this episode in terms of links, etc., and decide what you want to do from there. But if you enjoy this episode, make sure you don't miss out on any future episodes of the podcast by heading on over to thetaxprofessionalspodcast.com/subscribe to sign up for email notifications. Episodes are bi-weekly and are released on Mondays. But that's it for this episode. I hope you found the episode useful and have taken away some useful points to help you to progress, develop, and improve your tax career. Until next time.